blood ruins leather. That was the only thought rattling in his skull as her head slumped against the passenger door. Not the sirens, not the hitmen, just the sticky, copper-smelling mess soaking into the upholstery. She wasn't supposed to bleed. She wasn't supposed to be here at all. The windshield was gone, blown out by a stray slug from a Mac-10, leaving only a jagged perimeter of safety glass that chewed at the wind. Rain whipped through the open cabin, cold and smelling heavily of exhaust and wet asphalt. Luca didn't shiver. He hadn't felt the temperature in 3 hours. His hands were locked onto the steering wheel, knuckles sharp and white beneath the skin, the tendons of his forearms rigid as steel cables. Beside him, Harper made a sound. It wasn't a scream. A scream would have meant she had air in her lungs. It was a wet, ragged hitch, the sound of a drowning engine or a crushed bird. Luca glanced over. The street lamps of the industrial district flashed through the ruined car, strobing harsh yellow light over her face. She was pale. Not the poetic porcelain of old paintings, but the sickly, waxen grey of a corpse left too long in the morgue. Her chin rested on her chest. The seatbelt, designed to save a life, was currently acting as a crude tourniquet against her collarbone, slick and shining with a dark, heavy liquid. "Harper!" he barked. His voice was rough, choked with the cordite dust still lingering in his throat. He hated the way it sounded. Panicked. Luca Moretti did not panic. He broke fingers. He burned warehouses. He balanced ledgers written in human misery. But he never panicked. She didn't answer. Her eyelashes, clumped with rain, fluttered against her cheeks. He slammed his boot on the accelerator. The engine of the Audi screamed in protest, a terrible metallic grinding echoing from the front axle. They had clipped a guardrail during the ambush. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the 4 miles between the docks and the safe house. Luca hated messes. His entire life was constructed around order. The syndicate operated on a strict hierarchy of cause and effect, an ecosystem where violence was a currency, spent carefully and logged meticulously. Harper was never meant to be part of the ledger. She was an architect, a civilian with ink-stained fingers and a habit of chewing on the ends of her pens, hired to design the facade of a legitimate hotel down by the waterfront. She smelled like drafting paper and cheap vanilla coffee. She complained about his taste in modern art. She was ordinary. And now she was bleeding out in his passenger seat because someone had decided to send a message. The car slammed into a pothole. Harper jolted, a sharp gasp tearing from her throat. Her head rolled to the side and her eyes opened. The pupils were blown wide, swallowing the hazel irises entirely, leaving 2 black pits of sheer shock. "Luca," she breathed. The word barely had any sound behind it. "Don't talk," he said, his eyes glued to the slick road ahead. "Keep your hand pressed on it." She looked down at her shoulder. Her hand was already there, but her fingers were limp, slipping against the saturated fabric of her wool coat. The coat was supposed to be camel-coloured. Now, the entire left side was a wet, heavy black. "I can't," she whispered. Her chin trembled. "My fingers are numb. It's so warm." The cynicism that usually armoured Luca's mind cracked. He knew what that warmth meant. Arterial blood. The human body holds about 5 litres. Judging by the puddle forming in the footwell, she had already lost one. "Press it down, Harper, do it," he snapped, the harshness of a decade of command bleeding into his tone. She flinched at his volume, tears spilling over her lower lids, mixing with the rain on her face. But she tried. She pushed her small hand against the wound, biting her bottom lip so hard it split. He hated himself for yelling. He hated the men who pulled the trigger. But mostly he hated the creeping, cold realization sinking into his gut. He was losing her. The man who owned half the city's politicians, who commanded a small army of ghosts, could not stop a half-inch piece of lead from tearing his world apart. The safe house appeared through the downpour, a brutalist block of concrete disguised as an abandoned meatpacking plant. Luca didn't bother with the remote gate. He rammed the Audi straight through the chain-link fence, the metal screeching and snapping against the hood. He slammed the brakes, throwing the car into a violent spin that ended inches from the heavy steel loading doors. Before the engine even died, Luca was moving. He kicked his door open, the heavy rain instantly soaking his $3,000 suit, pasting his dark hair to his forehead. He rounded the hood, boots splashing in muddy puddles stained with oil, and wrenched the passenger door open. "All right," he breathed, unbuckling her. "I've got you." Harper fell toward him. He caught her, his large hands sinking into the wet, ruined fabric of her coat. She was impossibly light. The weight of her head rested in the crook of his neck. She smelled of iron. Pure, raw copper and iron. It overpowered the vanilla. It overpowered everything. He kicked the car door shut and carried her toward the entrance, his boots heavy on the concrete. The rain pounded against them, washing the blood from his knuckles only for it to be replaced a second later. "Stay with me," he thought, though he didn't say it aloud. "If you die, I will burn this entire city to the bedrock." The interior of the safe house was an exercise in industrial coldness. No rugs, no pictures, just concrete floors, exposed ductwork, and the heavy, stale smell of dust and ozone. Luca kicked the secondary security door shut behind them, plunging them into pitch blackness before the motion sensors triggered the overhead fluorescent lights. They hummed to life with an obnoxious electric buzz, casting a harsh, sterile glare over the room. He bypassed the leather sofa, too soft, too hard to clean, and headed straight for the kitchen. A massive stainless steel island sat in the centre. It was meant for meal prep. Today, it was an operating table. Luca set Harper down on the metal surface. Her head hit the steel with a dull, hollow thud. She moaned, a weak guttural sound that made the muscles in his jaw twitch. "I know," he muttered, stripping off his ruined suit jacket and tossing it to the floor. "I know!" He moved with frantic precision. First aid kit from the cabinet, scissors, gauze, rubbing alcohol, a bottle of cheap whiskey kept under the sink for bad nights. He slammed everything onto the counter next to her head. Harper's eyes were closed again. Her breathing was shallow, a terrifyingly rapid rise and fall of her chest. "Harper, look at me," Luca commanded, leaning over her. He tapped her cheek. Her skin was freezing. "Open your eyes." She didn't. He swore under his breath, grabbing the heavy trauma shears. He didn't bother trying to unbutton her coat or her blouse underneath. He hooked the bottom blade of the shears under the collar of her wool coat and cut downward. The thick fabric parted with a heavy tearing sound. He cut through the silk of her blouse next, peeling the layers back to expose her shoulder. The sight of it made his stomach bottom out. It was a mess. The bullet had entered just below her collarbone. The entry wound was a jagged hole, but the damage around it was catastrophic. The flesh was bruised a violent, angry purple, and the blood was welling up thick and dark. It wasn't a clean through and through. The bullet had splintered. "Christ," Luca hissed, his hands hovering over the wound. They were shaking. The butcher of the West Side, the man who had calmly carved a traitor's eye out 3 years ago, without his pulse rising above 70, was trembling. He ripped open a package of sterile gauze. "Harper, this is going to hurt," he warned her, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. He pressed the wad of gauze directly into the hole. Harper's back arched off the metal table. Her eyes snapped open, wide and wild with agony. A scream tore from her throat, raw and deafening, bouncing off the concrete walls. Her hands flew up, her nails digging into Luca's forearms, trying to push him away. "Hold still," he grunted, fighting her frantic movements. He leaned his weight into his hands, maintaining the pressure on the wound. "Stop! Stop!" she shrieked, kicking her legs. Her heel slammed against the side of the steel island. "Please, God, Luca, stop! I can't. You're bleeding out. I have to pack it." He reached for the bottle of alcohol with his free hand, popping the cap off with his thumb. The smell of astringent hit the air, sharp and chemical. "Harper," he said, his voice dropping an octave, trying to find that tone of absolute authority he used to command rooms full of killers. "Look at the ceiling. Bite your tongue. Do not move." He poured the alcohol directly over the open wound. Harper didn't scream this time. Her lungs seized, her jaw locked tight, the tendons in her neck straining so hard they looked like they might snap. Her body went rigid, vibrating on the metal table, every muscle locking down in sheer, unadulterated torment. The only sound in the room was the harsh, wet shh of her pulling air through her gritted teeth. Luca didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. He used the forceps to pick out a shard of shattered bone, dropping it onto the steel counter with a sharp clink. He grabbed more gauze, shoving it deep into the wound cavity, packing it tight to stop the arterial bleeding. His hands were covered in her blood, slippery and hot. "Almost done," he lied. He knew the mob doctor, Russo, was at least 20 minutes away. He just needed to keep her alive until then. "You're doing fine. You're doing fine." Harper's grip on his arm weakened. Her fingers slid off his skin, leaving smeared, bloody handprints. The fight drained out of her all at once. Her head lolled to the side, facing him. Tears were streaming continuously down her temples, mixing with the blood in her hair. Her breathing was slowing down, becoming dangerously shallow again. The panic in her eyes was fading, replaced by a hollow, terrifying exhaustion. Luca taped the heavy pressure dressing down. He pulled back, his chest heaving, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. He looked at her. He looked at the blood on the floor, the ruined clothes, the pale, shattered woman lying on a kitchen island. Harper blinked slowly. She looked up at the harsh fluorescent lights, then slowly dragged her gaze to Luca. Her lips parted. "Luca," she whispered. "I'm here," he said, stepping closer, leaning over her so his face was inches from hers. "Russo's coming. Just hold on." She didn't seem to hear him. She looked right through him, her eyes clouded with the kind of pain that breaks a human mind, the kind of pain that strips away dignity, fear, and hope, leaving only the animal desire for an end. Her lips moved again. The sound was so fragile it barely disturbed the air between them. "It hurts too much." That sentence, 5 words. Luca had heard men beg for their lives. He had heard them scream for their mothers, bargain their fortunes, and curse his name as he ended them. He had watched seasoned enforcers break under the pressure of a blade, their pride dissolving into weeping puddles. None of it had ever touched him. He was a vault. He was empty inside. But Harper's whisper was different. It wasn't a plea for him to stop. She knew he couldn't stop. It wasn't a bargain. It was a surrender. She was telling him she was done. She was too tired to keep fighting the pain, too small to endure the monstrous violence his world had inflicted upon her. She was letting go. Something inside Luca, some foundational pillar that held up the ruthless, cynical bastard he had spent 20 years building, snapped. It didn't just crack. It shattered into dust. The heavy steel forceps slipped from his bloody fingers and clattered loudly onto the floor. He didn't pick them up. He didn't reach for his phone to yell at Russo to drive faster. He didn't pace the room, cursing the men who had done this. Luca Rossi, the untouchable boss, looked at his hands. They were stained crimson up to the wrists. He looked at Harper, lying on the cold steel, trembling, her eyes slipping shut as the darkness began to pull her under. "No," he said. His voice was cracked, barely a croak. He didn't know what to do. His money was useless here. His guns couldn't shoot the pain away. His authority meant nothing to a severed artery. For the first time in his adult life, he was utterly, completely powerless. "Harper, no," he said again, louder this time. He grabbed the edge of the stainless steel island. Then, in a movement devoid of any grace or dignity, he hauled himself up onto the table with her. He didn't care about the sterile field he had tried to create. He didn't care about the blood soaking into his silk shirt, or the sharp edges of the medical instruments pressing into his knees. He crawled over the cold metal and lay down beside her. He gathered her against him. He was careful of her ruined shoulder, but he wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He threw one of his heavy legs over hers, pinning her down, covering her shivering body with his own heat. "I've got you," he rasped, burying his face in the damp, blood-matted hair at the nape of her neck. "I'm right here." Harper gave a weak, pathetic cry, trying to pull away from the contact. The pain was making her hypersensitive. Even the brush of his clothing against her skin was agony. "It hurts," she sobbed, the sound muffled against his chest. "Let me go. Please, let me sleep." "I can't do that," Luca whispered fiercely. His voice was shaking. The man who never showed emotion was weeping. Hot, angry tears spilled from his eyes, tracking through the dirt and blood on his face, dropping onto her pale skin. "I can't let you sleep, Harper. You don't get to leave me." He pressed his hand flat against her uninjured chest, feeling the weak, erratic flutter of her heart. It felt like a dying moth trapped in a jar. "You listen to me," he said, his lips grazing her ear. He stripped away the sarcasm, the aloofness, the terrifying mob boss persona. He gave her the only thing he had left, his own desperate, pathetic truth. "I am terrified. Do you hear me? I am out of my mind right now." Harper's breathing hitched. She stopped struggling. The sheer shock of hearing Luca Rossi admit fear seemed to tether her to consciousness. "I've ruined everything I've ever touched," he continued, the words spilling out of him like blood from a wound. He squeezed his eyes shut, tightening his grip on her. He smelled the iron, the iodine, and the faint, lingering trace of vanilla. "Everything, but not you. I won't let my mess touch you. I'm selfish, Harper. I am a deeply selfish man. And I need you to stay awake because I cannot live in this world if you aren't in it." He felt her tremble against him. The heavy rhythmic thud of his own heart beat against her spine, trying to force its strength into her failing body. "The pain," she gasped, her voice trembling. "Luca, it's tearing me apart." "Give it to me," he demanded. He pressed his face harder against her neck, breathing in her scent, trying to ground her with the sheer, crushing weight of his presence. "Focus on my voice. Focus on my hands. Hate me if you want to. Curse my name. Blame me for this. I did this to you. Get angry, Harper. Get angry at me. Just don't close your eyes." He rocked her gently, back and forth on the hard metal table. It was an absurd, heartbreaking sight. A man wearing the ruins of a bespoke suit, covered in blood, cradling a half-dead woman on a kitchen counter in an abandoned warehouse. "You complain about my art," he rambled, his voice breaking, desperate to fill the silence. "You said the painting in my office looks like a child threw up on a canvas. You're right, it's garbage. You can burn it. You can redesign the whole house. Just breathe. Come on, Harper, one more breath." He felt her fingers twitch. Slowly, agonizingly, her uninjured hand reached across her body. Her cold, blood-slick fingers found his wrist. She gripped it weakly. "You're crushing me," she whispered, her voice laced with exhaustion and the faintest, thinnest thread of a bitter smile. Luca let out a choked sound that was half laugh, half sob. He didn't loosen his grip. He held her tighter, anchoring her to the earth, using his own broken soul as the gravity to keep her from floating away. "Good," he breathed against her skin as the distant wailing sound of Russo's sirens finally bled through the thick concrete walls. "Complain about it. Stay awake and complain." The heavy steel door of the loading dock screeched, the rusted hinges whining like a dying animal over the sound of the rain. Footsteps echoed against the concrete, heavy, hurried, splashing through the puddles Luca had dragged into the warehouse. "Russo!" Luca roared, his voice cracking. He didn't turn his head. He couldn't take his eyes off Harper's chest, watching the shallow, terrifyingly slow rise and fall of her breathing. Dr. Russo didn't waste breath on a greeting. He was a man who existed entirely in the shadows of the syndicate's mistakes, a former trauma surgeon who had lost his license to a gambling debt and found salvation in stitching up men who couldn't walk into a hospital. He dropped a heavy canvas duffel bag onto the concrete. It hit with a dense metallic clatter. He smelled like stale menthols, bleach and wet wool. "Step back, boss," Russo rasped, snapping a pair of blue nitrile gloves over his thick, calloused fingers. "As I'm not leaving her," Luca snarled, his arm still locked around Harper's waist, his body still shielding hers from the cold of the room. Russo didn't argue. He didn't have the time or the authority. He simply crowded in next to Luca, shining a harsh penlight directly into Harper's eyes. Her pupils contracted sluggishly. "You're hypovolemic shock," Russo muttered, tossing the light onto the counter. He unzipped the duffel. "She's dumping blood faster than her heart can pump it. You applied pressure?" "Yes." "Move your hand." "She'll bleed out, Russo." "Move the goddamn hand, Luca, or I can't clamp the artery." It was the first time in 10 years anyone had raised their voice at Luca Moretti and kept their teeth. Luca swallowed the violent instinct rising in his throat and slowly peeled his hand back. The gauze he had packed into the wound was soaked black. Russo didn't hesitate. He grabbed a pair of long serrated hemostats from his bag and pulled the saturated cotton out in one swift, brutal motion. Harper didn't scream this time. She didn't have the strength. She merely let out a high, thin whine, a sound so utterly defeated it made Luca's stomach turn over. Her head rolled toward Luca, her eyes half-lidded and glassy, unfocused. "Got it," Russo grunted, his fingers slick with her blood as he blindly dug the clamps into the torn muscle of her shoulder. A sharp click echoed in the quiet room as the metal jaws locked down on the severed vessel. The welling of dark blood immediately slowed to an angry seep. "You got lucky," Russo breathed, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist. It missed the subclavian artery by a fraction of a millimeter. If it hit that, she would have bled out in the car. But the bullet shattered the clavicle. There are bone fragments everywhere. "Fix it," Luca demanded. The adrenaline was beginning to curdle in his veins, turning into a cold, toxic sludge. "I have to dig the lead out and clean the fragments. I only have local anesthetic, Luca. It's not going to be enough. Not for this." Russo looked up, his dark eyes meeting Luca's. "You need to hold her down. If she thrashes while I'm in the pocket, I'll sever the nerve bundle and she'll never use this arm again." Luca looked down at her. Her skin was freezing, covered in a sheen of cold sweat. The vanilla scent was gone entirely now, replaced by the sharp, terrifying odours of copper, iodine, and raw meat. "Harper," Luca whispered, leaning his forehead against her uninjured temple. "I'm right here. I'm going to hold you down. I am so sorry." Russo plunged a syringe of lidocaine in a wide circle around the ragged hole in her shoulder. Harper twitched, but the real agony began when Russo picked up the heavy forceps and went hunting for the bullet. The metal scraped against bone. It was a vile, grating sound that vibrated through the stainless steel island. Harper's body violently rejected the intrusion. Her spine arched, her legs kicking out desperately, her good hand tearing at the collar of Luca's ruined silk shirt. "Hold her!" Russo barked. Luca threw his entire weight across her legs, pinning them to the table. He trapped her flailing right arm against his chest, wrapping both of his hands around her head, pressing her face into his shoulder to muffle the terrible raw sounds tearing from her throat. I know, he chanted, a desperate broken litany against her hair. She bit him. In her blind, animalistic panic, her teeth clamped down on the meat of his shoulder, right through his shirt. She bit down hard enough to draw blood. Luca didn't flinch. He didn't care. He welcomed the pain. It was a fraction of what she was enduring. He held her tighter, absorbing her screams, absorbing the violent tremors racking her frame, wishing he could pull the agony out of her bones and drag it into his own. "Got the slug," Russo grunted. A deformed, mushroomed piece of lead clattered into a metal kidney dish. Now the bone. For 20 minutes, the warehouse was a chamber of horrors. The only sounds were the scrape of metal on bone, Russo's heavy breathing, and Harper's muffled, agonizing cries against Luca's skin. Luca kept his eyes closed the entire time. He was a man who ordered executions, a man who had watched buildings burn with people inside, but he could not bear to look at the torn flesh of the woman he loved. The woman he loved. The realization hit him like a physical blow, heavy and undeniable. He hadn't admitted it to himself. He had hidden it behind the guise of protecting an asset, or enjoying her company. But it was the truth. It was the reason his hands were shaking. It was the reason the smell of her blood was going to haunt him until the day he died. "I have to cauterize the smaller bleeders," Russo warned, his voice tight. "Hold her breath. This is going to smell bad." Luca buried his face in her neck. The sharp electronic whine of the portable cautery pen filled the air, immediately followed by the sickening, sweet and foul odor of burning flesh. Harper convulsed against him one last time, her body going completely rigid before the final reserve of her adrenaline gave out. She went limp. Her jaw went slack against his shoulder, her breathing leveling out into a shallow, exhausted rhythm. She had passed out. She's out," Russo muttered, sounding relieved. "It's better this way. Let me stitch her up." Luca didn't move. He kept his body draped over hers, his hands tangled in her hair, feeling the faint, fragile thud of her pulse against his cheek. He stayed there as Russo threaded a curved needle through her pale skin, pulling the jagged edges of the wound together with thick black sutures. He stayed there as Russo wrapped her chest in tight, clean bandages. "We need to start an IV," Russo said, tapping a bag of saline. "Pump some fluids back into her, and antibiotics. A lot of them." "Will she live?" Luca asked. The question felt entirely foreign in his mouth. He never asked for odds. He dictated them. If she doesn't get an infection, if the shock doesn't trigger cardiac arrest, if the men who shot her don't come back and finish the job. Russo taped the IV line to the back of Harper's pale hand. "She needs a hospital, Luca. She needs a proper surgical theatre. If I take her to a hospital, she's dead in an hour," Luca said, his voice returning to the cold, dead flatline of the mob boss. The panic was receding, replaced by a deep, dark rage. "The police are on the payroll. The nurses are on the payroll. She stays here." Russo sighed, packing his bloody instruments back into the duffel bag. "Then she's in your hands. Keep her warm, keep her hydrated. If she spikes a fever, call me." Russo left as quietly as he had arrived. The heavy door groaned shut, the locking mechanism engaging with a loud final clank. Luca was alone again. He finally stepped back from the table. His legs felt like lead. He looked down at his hands. They were coated in a thick, drying crust of dark red. It was under his fingernails. It was in the deep lines of his palms. He walked over to the industrial sink in the corner of the room. He turned the heavy brass handles. The water came out freezing cold, splashing against the stainless steel basin. Luca shoved his hands under the stream. He grabbed a stiff, bristled brush meant for scrubbing grease off car parts and a bar of cheap industrial lye soap. He scrubbed. He dragged the harsh bristles over his knuckles, over his palms, tearing at his own skin in a desperate, frantic attempt to get her off him. The water circling the drain turned a bright, violent pink. He scrubbed until his hands were raw, until the skin was red and stinging, until every trace of her blood was washed down the pipes. But it didn't help. He could still smell it. He could still feel the awful, sticky warmth of it. He leaned his forearms against the edge of the sink, hanging his head. The water ran. The fluorescent lights hummed. For the first time in his life, Luca Moretti wept not out of fear, but out of absolute, crushing guilt. 3 hours later, the rain had stopped. The warehouse was deathly quiet, insulated from the sounds of the city waking up outside. Luca sat in a cheap vinyl folding chair pulled directly up to the edge of the metal island. He had moved Harper to the leather sofa. He had laid down heavy plastic tarps first, then a layer of clean wool blankets. She was tucked under them now, only her uninjured arm and the pale, bruised column of her neck visible. Luca had changed. He found a black t-shirt and a pair of dark denim jeans in a locker in the back room. His ruined suit was sitting in a trash bag by the door, waiting to be incinerated. He sat perfectly still, his forearms resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the slow rise and fall of the grey wool blanket covering her chest. He was waiting. The rage in his chest had crystallized. He had already sent 3 texts from a burner phone. By midnight, the men who had ambushed his car would be dragged into a soundproof basement across town. He would deal with them himself, but right now he couldn't leave this chair. Harper shifted on the sofa. A low, dry groan slipped through her lips. Luca was out of the chair and kneeling beside her before she even opened her eyes. "Harper," he said quietly. Her eyelashes fluttered. They were heavy, sticking together. It took her a long time to pry them apart. When she finally looked at him, her hazel eyes were cloudy with the morphine Russo had pushed into her a V before he left. She blinked, staring at the exposed ductwork on the ceiling, then slowly dragged her gaze down to his face. "You changed your shirt," she murmured. Her voice was incredibly weak, raspy from screaming. Luca let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 3 hours. A tiny broken smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. "My other one was ruined." She tried to move her left arm. A sharp hiss of pain escaped her teeth, and her eyes widened as the memory of the night came crashing down on her through the fog of drugs. The car, the gunfire, the metal table. "Don't move it," Luca commanded gently, resting his large warm hand over her right one. "Your collarbone is broken. The bullet is out, but you need to stay perfectly still." She looked at his hand resting over hers. His knuckles were raw and red from the lye soap. Then she looked up at his face. He expected to see fear. He expected her to shrink away from him. She was a civilian. She designed lobbies for boutique hotels and argued about colour palettes. She had just been dragged through the absolute gutter of his reality. She had every right to look at him like a monster, but she didn't. She just looked tired. "Who were they?" she asked. "Competitors," Luca said. The word tasted like ash. "A rival syndicate moving in from the docks. They were aiming for me. You were collateral." "Collateral," she repeated, tasting the ugly corporate word. "I shouldn't have put you in the car. I shouldn't have let you walk out of the office with me. It was careless." Luca's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his skin. He couldn't look her in the eye anymore. He stared at the concrete floor. "I broke my own rules, Harper. I let you get close, and because of my arrogance, you almost died on a kitchen counter." Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. "I'm sending you away," Luca said. The words felt like swallowing broken glass. "When you're stable, I have a house in Geneva. It's clean. It's safe. I have private doctors who will reconstruct your shoulder. You'll have enough money in an account to live comfortably for the rest of your life. You will never have to see me or this city ever again." He waited for her to agree. He waited for the relief to wash over her face. Instead, Harper turned her head slightly on the makeshift pillow. She looked at the harsh fluorescent lights, then at the blood-stained metal island a few feet away, and finally back to him. "You cried," she said softly. Luca froze, his head snapped up. "On the table," she continued, her voice gaining a fraction of strength, though it still trembled. "When you were holding me down, you told me I couldn't sleep. You cried on my neck." Luca swallowed hard. The untouchable boss of the West Side, stripped completely bare by a woman heavily dosed on morphine. "I thought you were dying." "I was," she said simply. "It hurt too much to stay." "But you stayed." "Because you asked me to." She slipped her right hand out from under his palm and slowly, painfully, turned her wrist so she could thread her fingers through his. Her hand was so small. Her skin was pale and cool, a stark contrast to the calloused, violent warmth of his own. "Geneva is pouring," Harper whispered, her eyelids drooping as the exhaustion threatened to pull her under again. "And you have terrible taste in art. Someone has to fix it." Luca stared at her. His heart, a hardened muscle that pumped ice water for a living, gave a violent, painful thud against his ribs. "Ya Harper, be rational," he pleaded, his voice thick with a desperate kind of grief. "You don't understand what this world is. You don't understand what I am. I ordered men to be butchered today. I will order more tonight. If you stay with me, there will be more blood. There will always be blood." "I know," she murmured, her eyes finally closing. "But you washed your hands." She drifted off to sleep, her breathing evening out into a steady, narcotic rhythm. Luca remained kneeling beside the sofa for a long time. He looked at their joined hands. She was a fool. A beautiful, naive, brilliant fool. She had no idea the kind of darkness she was tethering herself to. But as Luca stood up, gently releasing her hand and tucking it back beneath the heavy wool blanket, a terrifying clarity washed over him. He was a selfish man. He had told her that on the table, and he meant it. He was not going to let her go. He walked to the corner of the warehouse and picked up his heavy wool overcoat. He pulled his sidearm from the holster, checking the magazine with a sharp, mechanical click. If she was going to stay in his world, he was going to have to change the world. He was going to have to pave the streets in the bones of his enemies so she would never trip. Luca Moretti opened the heavy steel door, stepping out into the cold, damp morning of a city he was about to set on fire. Did Luca's choice break your heart? The line between monster and protector just blurred forever. If you felt every ragged breath an impossible decision in this story, don't let the journey end here. Hit that like button if you want to see Luca tear the city down to keep Harper safe. Share this video with someone who loves dark, emotional romance, and subscribe to the channel for the next explosive chapter of their story. See you in the shadows.